Look closer. They're not sleeping, they're gone. Yet in the 1800s, families across Britain, Europe, and America paid photographers to take pictures of their loved ones after death, dressed, posed, and arranged to look as if they were still alive. This wasn't horror, it was love. Love caught between memory and loss. Before the age of cameras and smartphones, these portraits, called post-mortem photographs, were often the only image a family would ever have of their child, parent, or spouse. To the Victorians, death wasn't something to hide. It was something to remember, to honor, and even to beautify through art. This is the story of one of history's strangest and most deeply human rituals, photographing the dead. Before the 1840s, having your portrait made was a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford a painting to preserve their likeness. Then, in 1839, everything changed. A French inventor named Louis Daguerre introduced the daguerreotype, the first publicly available photographic process. For the first time in history, anyone could hold a reflection of life or death in their hands. These early photos were detailed, almost eerily lifelike. At first, they were expensive, printed on polished silver plates. But soon, new techniques, the ambrotype and tintype, made photography cheaper and faster. By the 1850s, even working-class families could afford a single portrait. But it still required long exposures and absolute stillness, and death, ironically, provided both. In the quiet after loss, the camera could finally capture what the living could no longer hold. The Victorian era was steeped in death because death was everywhere. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, and scarlet fever tore through families. In 1851, nearly half of all deaths in England were children under 10. Every household knew grief. Mourning became a language. Black clothing, lockets filled with hair, and poems dedicated to the departed. Death wasn't a stranger, it was a constant presence. And so, Victorians learned not to look away. They faced it, they ritualized it. Photographing the dead wasn't morbid to them, it was an act of preservation, a way to say, you were here, you mattered, a final goodbye, frozen in silver and light. The earliest post-mortem daguerreotypes appeared in the 1840s. At first, they were simple, a body laid out, eyes closed, resting peacefully. But as the art of photography evolved, families wanted more than stillness. They wanted remembrance, the illusion of life. Children were posed sitting up, their eyes sometimes painted open directly onto the print afterward. Mothers cradled their infants for one last embrace. Photographers used hidden metal braces, posing stands, to hold the body upright, as though simply resting for a portrait. One London studio manual from 1868 even gave instructions on how to secure the body in a natural position for the likeness. To us, it sounds eerie. To them, it was healing. They weren't capturing death, they were capturing memory. No one embodied mourning more than Queen Victoria herself. When her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she was devastated. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years. Every home she entered, every portrait she commissioned, bore his image. Her grief became a blueprint for an entire culture. The Victorians turned mourning into an art, filled with rules, symbols, and rituals. Post-mortem photography became part of that ritual. They were placed in velvet cases, hung beside the living on mantles, or carried close in lockets. They weren't seen as grim reminders. They were cherished keepsakes, a way to hold love in physical form, to remember even when the body was gone. By the mid-1800s, photographing the dead was a quiet profession, but a respected one. Studios in London, Paris, and New York offered mourning sittings. Photographers like John Mayall in London and Matthew Brady in America
famous for portraits of the living, also captured the departed. The process was handled with care. Bodies were dressed in their best clothing, surrounded by flowers or mementos. Children were photographed with toys or books, symbols of innocence. Adults were posed with hands gently folded, faces peaceful. The goal wasn't shock, it was comfort, to create the illusion that their loved one was only resting. Sometimes the living joined the frame, a mother beside her child, a husband beside his wife, and often it's hard to tell who is alive and who is not. Early photography blurred that line, turning life and death into one still moment. By the mid-1850s, the custom had spread across continents. In Britain, it was a normal part of mourning. In France, it was called le dernier portrait, the last portrait, a final gesture of respect. In America, it became common after the Civil War, when countless families never saw their loved ones return. Photographers began advertising memorial portraiture, a softer term for death photography. The prints were often touched with color, a hint of pink in the cheeks, a sparkle in the eyes, a small illusion of breath. It wasn't meant to deceive, it was meant to comfort, to say they were alive once and they are still loved. As the 20th century dawned, the world began to change. Photography was faster, easier, and everywhere. When Kodak's Brownie camera arrived in 1900, families could capture everyday life. Birthdays, playtime, love, death no longer needed to be photographed, because life itself could finally be remembered. Hospitals, funeral homes, and new attitudes toward death moved mourning out of the home. The Victorians' open acceptance of death slowly faded. What was once sacred began to feel strange. By the 1920s, post-mortem photography became taboo, misunderstood as grotesque or even disturbing. The ritual quietly disappeared. Today, when we stumble across these images, pale faces frozen in time, we often recoil. We see horror where they once saw tenderness. But to the Victorians, death wasn't something to fear. It was simply part of life's cycle, a last chapter of love. For many families, that single photograph was all they had. No gravestone, no videos, no digital memories, just one small print, proof that this person had existed, that they had been loved. It wasn't macabre, it was love made visible. A century later, collectors and historians began to unearth these forgotten photographs. In New York, Dr. Stanley B. Burns founded the Burns Archive, one of the largest collections of post-mortem photography in the world. Thousands of images, each one a glimpse into how deeply Victorians felt, how honestly they mourned. They remind us that modern society has grown distant from death, avoiding it, sanitizing it, pushing it out of sight. But the Victorians faced it head on. They looked at loss and said, "We will remember you, not through fear, but through art, ritual, and grace." These photographs don't haunt us because they show death. They move us because they show love. In an age when life was fragile, the camera gave people something miraculous, the chance to hold on just a little longer. Each photograph whispered the same quiet message. They were here, they were loved, they will be remembered. Today, we take millions of photos without thinking. But in 1850, one photograph was a lifetime, a bridge between memory and eternity. So next time you see one of those old Victorian portraits, don't look away, look deeper. You're not looking at death, you're looking at the depth of human love and the beauty of saying goodbye. The bizarre Victorian ritual of photographing the dead, 1840 to 1900, a culture that found beauty in goodbye.